When you have a legend in the room, you know you're in a room with a legend. I mean, I think for most people in the trade union movement, the opportunity to sit on a platform with Arthur Scargill is something that dreams are made of, and for me, this is like a dream come true. I mean, the miners' union has stood up for our class throughout history. And they knew that the only way that they could force change on this country was to destroy the NUM. And that's what they set about doing. But the person that stood in the way of them, and the person who was a real true class hero, a working class fighter, stood up and fought back, and they didn't like it, so they attacked him and they tried to undermine him. But he showed the strength and determination that all workers and these people in this country need to show, that despite the face of those attacks, despite what they wanted to try and do, he was prepared to stand up, take the beatings and still take them on. Arthur Scargill is a legend to this class, is a legend to the trade union movement, and we're really, really privileged to have Arthur Scargill talk to this conference 30 years after the miners' strike. And I'm sure the people in this room, Arthur, who moved a motion last year to invite you, because we adore you. We appreciate what you did on behalf of those working people and the communities, because we all know now, there is absolutely no denying that what you said was 100% right. That cow lied. You told the truth. Arthur Scargill, please welcome and address the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union Conference.
Arthur Scargill, miners section of the Bakers Food Allied Workers Union, moving emergency motion A. This is an opportunity to look back over the 4 days that you've had your conference, analyse the kind of speeches that you've heard, and put forward views that may resonate one way or another. I understand that you've had people speaking from a militant, determined point of view, and I congratulate the Executive Council and the comrades here in having the common sense to invite a moderate, reasonable man like me to address conference. This is the second time I've had the privilege of addressing delegates to this conference. And I want to make it absolutely clear, as the chairman said, that I come here from a working class point of view. I do not accept and never will the argument put forward by the sociologists and those from academia that there are different classes from the working class, the lower middle class, the upper middle class, and the higher class. As Marx said, there are only two classes within society: those who work by hand or by brain, and those who own and control. Every delegate in here belongs to the working class, and we should remember that. Now, I know that you will have been addressed this week by people who want to do a number of things. First of all, to continue support for the Labour Party, to continue to support the European Union, discuss the issue of immigration, migration, the minimum wage, pensions, the health scheme, a whole range of issues. I want to make my position absolutely clear, and that of the party which I now lead, the Socialist Labour Party. It was founded not in 1996, as you'll find on the internet. It was actually founded by James Connolly and others in 1903. And they warned that the Labour Representation Committee, which had been established in 1900, was no solution to the problems within society, which were fundamentally a capitalist, imperialist system. As Connolly said in the struggle for Irish independence, Irish independence will be useless if it means independence where we only have the replacement of the English as the rulers and the capitalists of Ireland taking over. The same principle I recall from Mandela. I knew him. And he said to me, we have to have a system where in South Africa we replace not merely apartheid, but we replace a system which is owned and controlled by the multinational corporations, and we do not want to see black capitalists take the place of white capitalists. And I think it's a fundamental lesson that all of us need to take into account. Now, we in Britain are facing austerity. Yet there is one difference between Britain at the moment and most of the other countries within the European Union. Throughout Europe, you have marches and demonstrations and strikes from people in the working class who are not prepared to any longer accept the austerity created as a result of the system under which we live. What a system. They tell us that we're in difficulty because of the crash, mainly in the United States. So what do? The banks say we're in trouble. By the way, the banks are private. So the government prints money, gives it billions, and says, that will save you. But then, who pays? We pay for their debt, their crisis, their catastrophe. I'll tell you what we should have done. We should have put the buggers in jail for what they've done to our system. Now, if there was a real desire to do anything, the billions that were made available should have been given to people with mortgages, with debts, to people in difficulty, so they could pay off any debt they had with the bank. And who could argue with that? The debt would be paid off, the bank's debt would be paid off, and people would have money to spend. But that is not the way capitalism works. It works in the interest of their class and their system. And if there's one thing every person in this room, particularly the youth, understand or should understand, it is this: that whenever and wherever we take into our hands any section or the whole section of society, we impose the same restraint upon their lot that they've imposed upon ours during their 100 years rule. The policies that I would advocate were rather scathingly attacked in a number of places, but not one political party could point out a deficiency. I remember that Ken Capstick, a member of our party and former vice chairman of our Yorkshire area, had a debate with Andrew Neil. Bit caustic, that bloke, you know. Now listen here, Mr. Capstick, you know. He says, you're going to take money from private wealth schemes, pension schemes, to pay for your policy. So, of course, Capsic says, absolutely. There's 3.6 trillion pounds in these private pension wealth schemes. We only need 746 billion to pay for the entire programme we put forward. So Andrew Neil's response was a classic. I mean, we ought to engrave it. He said, in that case, he said, the entrepreneurs would leave Britain. And Ken said, and I've said, put them on the bloody Queen Mary, sail it out, and get rid of them once and for all. They wouldn't be missed. Now, obviously, I heard the tail end of a speech when I came into the hall about the European Union. I've just come back from Dublin. There's more brass plates in Dublin than there is in a brass foundry. Every company are there for tax breaks, but the people of Ireland are suffering. So don't let people say that Ireland's doing all right within the European Union. I'll tell you what's happening, shall I? The Irish people, and I'm half Irish, were told after the Rising that never again would a family be evicted, no matter what the circumstances. Never again would there be a water charge in Ireland. There's a slight drop of rain drops in Ireland every year. And what have they done? They are evicting people in Ireland. What have they done? They're imposing water charges. There are massive demonstrations all over Ireland. You've read about them, have you? Not in your life. There isn't one single newspaper, no television program broadcasts any opposition that takes place. And the reason is simple. They don't want you to see that other workers in other countries are opposing what is happening. Now, I believe that we need to discuss the issues fundamentally. Our party and I have always fought for a socialist system of society. And I want to make my position absolutely clear. The European Union was established to create a United States of Europe. It was the concept of Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill, for those who don't know. It was a system created and established in order to create a European army. It's now called NATO. The irony was that during the debates on television, when the Scottish National Party leader, Nicola Sturgeon, was arguing her case very eloquently, not one speaker opposed her on the fundamental weakness of her case and their policy. Our argument is that we want to stay in the European Union if we get independence, but even in the event that we don't, we want to stay in the European Union. And we also want to stay as a member of NATO. Well, how the hell does she square that argument with the policy they've got of getting rid of Trident? Because they wouldn't let them do it. The quicker we do that, get rid of Trident and all nuclear weapons in this country, the better. The health service. I've got a vested interest in many ways. I have a half a knee. I have two wrists that are completely knackered as a result of 20 years working underground. And I know what's needed in the health service. It needs an input of 20 billion now, not in 5 years or 8 years' time. We need more doctors, more nurses, more staff, more ancillary workers, cleaners, all those people who go towards making the health service that was the vision of socialists throughout the centuries. Why can't we do it? This lot in power now and the Labour Party both say we can't afford it. Well, I'll give them a mathematic solution. Cut the defence budget by 2/3, scrap the Trident programme, and you can pay $22 billion immediately on day one. That's the way that you fund the National Health Service. The question is, do we vote, do we support death and destruction, or do we support the concept of human life and the dignity of human life, irrespective of the costs involved? I know that every family, possibly in this hall, will have been touched one way or another by possibly non-admission to an hospital, or there's no room, or the drugs are too expensive. The drug companies should be taken into common ownership immediately. And the drugs that are available should be given to people free of charge, as they were in 1948. That's the way to tackle the health service. But of course there are other major issues like the minimum wage. What debates we've had about the minimum wage. Ed Miliband says we want a living wage. Well, I'll accept the same living wage that MPs get. I think it's a reasonable one. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for you. If it was good enough for me when I was a full-time official, it's good enough for miners who work down the pit, or for people who work in your industry. But I'll tell you the solution, shall I? We should have a minimum wage equal to the national average wage. If you do that, I'll tell you what you get. Your national minimum wage today would be $26,000 a year. It would end this so-called 0 hours contracts. It's called really slave labour. And I've got nothing but utter contempt for those trade unions who are actually employing youngsters on 0 hour bloody contracts. It's time they stopped and looked at themselves. Of course, linked with that are pensions. Pensioners were promised, we're always given promises. They were promised that when they retired, they would have a guaranteed pension linked to inflation or the highest increase in the average wage for the rest of their lives. It was a pledge by a Labour government. And what happened? The Tories scrapped it. So much for decisions in Parliament. Well, in my view, pensioners in the twilight years ought to have the very best, not a second rate. They ought to be in a position where they can live with dignity. And that's why I argue, and my party argues, that the national pension should be equal to the national average wage. They would get immediately $26,000 a year, and they have earned it. Of course, what I'm talking is real militancy, isn't it? And some people, like the Daily Mail, yes, and the Daily Mirror, they'll accuse me of saying that Scargil is wanting revolution. Too bloody true I am. I actually thought in my simplicity that trade unions have got the right to strike. And I actually thought throughout the 70s and 80s that not only the rules of our union and yours provided you with that right under the United Nations Charter and the International Labour Organization, Article 87, to which Britain is a signatory. But I was wrong, apparently. They took me to court. And they said, do you realise that you are in breach of law because you've called a strike without a ballot? Pretty bloody rich, isn't it? From a government that's been elected by 20% of those entitled to vote, telling us what we should do and what we shouldn't do. Well, for the historical point of view, the then National Coal Board and government decided on a new tactic. They would launch closures on an area basis. And so we decided we'd study warfare. We would fight back on an area basis within our rules. We were taken to court. Magaki, Heathfield and me. And we went to see this eminent barrister. Very eminent. And our lawyer, she said, this man's so good, you'll have no problem. You will win hands down. So we saw him and he said, Mr. Scargill, he said, if you can give me an undertaking that you will not move the monies that you apparently relocated abroad, he said, I'm quite sure that my opposite number will agree that this case can be stayed. And that will be the end of that. You won't be in sequestration or receivership. So my solicitor, she said, Willie, that was his name, do you think it will be necessary to use Fossen Arbottle? I thought you were talking about a sauce. He said, oh, dear me. No, Jane, not at all. No, we can't go that far. No. And he picked up the telephone and he phoned his opposite number. And he said, yes, I've got Mr. Scargill here with his colleagues. Yes, he's perfectly willing to leave the monies where they are. Yes. Oh, good show. See you in court. So we go along. They're all in there, like penguins. So my barrister stood up and said, we've reached an agreement. And their barrister stood up, representing the case against us, and said, my lord, that is absolutely correct. I thought, great. There's a bloke at the back of the court stood up and he said, my lord, I realise I have no right of audience in this court, but may I pray to be heard? I thought, who's he? The judge says, you do realise you've no rights of audience here? Yes, my lord. He said, go ahead. And he spoke for 4 hours. And at the end of it, they ruled that we were acting unlawfully. This barrister says, I can't believe it. And we went to the Court of Appeal on a Saturday night. 3 judges, he said, I'm going to have to throw Fossen Arbottle. I thought, they're in trouble, this lot. They don't know what's coming. By the way, Fossen Arbottle, I learned, is a very famous case. And it says, by the way, it was designed not for you as trade unionists or me. It was designed for companies. And if a person who works for an organisation has a complaint, say in a factory where members of this union are working, you are required to go through the various stages of a complaint at local level, a complaint at area level, a complaint at national level, and if you're not satisfied, you then have to wait for the annual general meeting in a year, or it might be 2 years' time, dependent on the Articles of Association. And so, of course, Fossen Arbottle applied to us. So if they wanted to appeal against the decision we'd taken, they would have to wait for a year. Reasonable. He put Fossen Arbottle, and they threw it straight back at him and said, we don't accept it. And so for 1 year and 4 months, that's the accurate figure, we were on strike, fighting for a principle in which we believed. We didn't fight for an increase in wages. We didn't just fight because we wanted to take a strike. We fought for the right of future generations, our sons and our daughters, to have a job. I doubt whether there's one person in this hall, apart from the officials who I told last night. In 1984, at the same time as the court was hearing the case in England, the Scottish High Court was also hearing the case from McGackie and Co. And the Scottish High Court ruled that the strike was legal. And one barrister said, we can always go to the European Court. I said, how long will that take? He says, 2 years. I said, forget it. We decided that we were right and that we had a responsibility to fight for our rights. And what did they do? They turned out a paramilitary force against us. And they attacked us from all angles. And if we had had the support of the trade union movement and of renegades in the Labour Party like Kinnock, instead of urging an end to the strike and conciliation, that strike would not only have been won in weeks, but there would have been no action taken against any other union, and that government would have fallen. That's the price that was paid for refusing to support us. They don't know how. They say they're going to make housing available at affordable rents in Britain. Why not? Why don't we have 1 million new or refurbished homes constructed each year? It's not a dream, it's a reality. The reason they don't want it is, if they build that number of houses, they can't charge the exorbitant rents that they're charging or the exorbitant mortgages that they're demanding. It works in the interest of the capitalists who own and control. Otherwise, they would have no difficulty putting the unemployed construction workers to work to build the houses so that people can live in dignity in the 21st century. Education is another argument that we put forward. Education is the right of every child, and every child's got a right to the best education. We've got a cabinet and a shadow cabinet where all of them virtually come from Oxbridge. And that's their right if they go to a university. But most of them have been to private schools at Winchester, or Harrow, or Eton, and they say it's their birthright to rule this country. And the problem is, what do we in the working class do about an education system that creates that division between the two classes? Well, our solution is simple. We will close all those privately owned schools, they're called public schools, and we would make them state schools so that our pupils went to a state school everywhere in Britain. Now, we're also against faith schools. How can anybody support a faith school in a world where religion of all types is preaching hatred, intolerance, and injustice? None more so than our religion, the Christian religion in Britain, who took across to Africa and India and Asia a Bible to try and persuade those populations to accept a religion, to go to their schools. It creates division if children are going to different schools. If it's right for a Muslim and a Hindu and a Buddhist and a Christian and a Sikh and any other religion to go to a university together in Britain. It's right they should go to a school together from the age of nil. I have to say, Chairman, a confession. I've had some experience of it. When I was a little younger, I was going out with a young woman, and we were getting on famously. And then suddenly, she stopped seeing me. And I thought, what, stop seeing me? How could she do that? I had more hair on then. So I waited one night while she came home from work and got off the bus. And I thought, well, face to face, if she tells me she doesn't want to go out with me, or she's got another bloke, fine, I understand that. And so I waited for her. When she saw me, she came to me. She started crying. She said, I love you. I said, well, it's a strange way of, displaying it really, isn't it? Not seeing me. She said, I'm not allowed to. I said, why? She says, Father says I can't. I said, well, that's crackers. I said, look, let's go down and see your dad, and I'll have a talk to him. I knew him very well, you know. She said, no, I don't mean my father. She said, I mean my father at church, the priest. I said, why is that? She said, oh, I can go out with you, and I can marry you, provided you'll resign from the Young Communist League and join our religion. I said, have you told him everything? She said, yes. I thought, Christ. You think this is a bit difficult. It's only 6 months since I saw her. She's a lot younger than me. She's 76, I'm 77. She said to me, you know I'm on my own now, don't you? I said, I didn't. She says, I go to a club every Friday playing bingo. You ought to come down. I thought, not likely, after all these bloody years. But you know what religion does? It creates division, doesn't it? And therefore, we are in favour of a sensible, funded education system where teachers are teaching small classes so they can be taught properly. They should be paid properly. The care assistants should be paid properly. The other ancillary staff, the cleaners, everybody should be paid properly. And of course, our minimum wage proposal would do just that. In other words, we would begin to build a real nation of people where dignity was the first priority. I have to say that unless people change their attitudes, nothing really will alter. Nothing really will change. I have to touch gently upon energy policy for no other reason than I understand from press reports that a large union in Britain has signed up to an agreement for fracking. Absolutely deplorable. It's one of the worst things that can happen on this earth. And I know about geology. I understand geology. I worked long enough at a coal face down a mine to know the nature of what happens. If you crack the strata plates, as fracking does, using masses of water which is contaminated immediately, you disturb the whole landscape. The noise is incredible. There is an emission far greater than the emissions they talk about in the mining industry. And on top of all of that, you've then got problems in and around the environmental issues across the board. That's why there are movements all over the world saying no. In France, they've said no fracking here. And that should be our policy in the labour and trade union movement of Britain. It's ridiculous. We've been lied to. We've been lied to for years. You were told, all of us were told, that the mines in Britain had to close because they were uneconomic. And then we were told that they were an environmental problem. And so they've gradually closed down economic pits. Pits that could produce a wonderful product. And what have they done? They import 44 million tons of coal from Russia and South Africa and use it here. What's the difference between that pollution and the pollution they argued we had in Britain? But if you look very carefully at the government papers, which they published after 30 years, I couldn't believe my eyes. It says Scargill was right. I must admit I would have preferred Scargill is left, but that's another question. But how many people have ever been told that in North Wales we developed in the mining industry at the point of air a completely new concept where we brought the coal out of the ground and we turned it immediately into liquid. From that liquid, we extracted oil, all that we need. From that coal, we extracted gas, all that we need. And don't forget, until the 1970s, all the gas in the United Kingdom came from coal. But this was an entirely new concept of gas without pollution. And thirdly, your petroleum for a car, and all the petrochemicals, for example, nylon, you name the fabric, whatever, all of it made from coal. Synthetic wood, all of it available. And what did they do? In 1985, at the end of the strike, they closed down this immediate concept that would have revolutionized not only this country, but many areas of the world. The coal industry could have been the centerpiece of a sensible policy which would lead us on to solar power, which really is the future for energy and the environment in Britain. We in the Socialist Labour Party want to see a sensible, integrated energy policy, one that means something to all people and improves the quality of human life. Transport, well, Bob Crow was a member of our party. He was the first industrial organiser. And we wanted to see all the transport industry taken back into public common ownership. Every time an industry gets in trouble, they nationalise it. Nationalisation should not be confused with common ownership. There's more common ownership in the United States than there is in Britain. If there's anything they want, like an armed force, it's in public ownership in America. Unless it's, secret and it's Blackwater. So a secret operation could go ahead. And yet here we are with a transport policy which is at least 80 years out of date, and instead of upgrading the systems that we have and putting the branch lines back into action, they're spending billions of pounds creating new connections which in my view are completely unnecessary. I believe that there is an answer to our problem, and that is to take into common and social ownership the whole transport industry. And if we did that, you would have a better environment. One train load of any commodity, it could be coal, steel, anything you want. One train load takes off the roads 700 juggernauts from all over Europe on our roads. Just think what it would do as far as the environment's concerned. 80% of the pollution in our atmosphere is emitted from gas and from oil. Fact from the Department of Energy. I know the nuclear industry is an anathema to anybody with common sense. I was telling your officials last night. I was the advocate at the Windscale public inquiry. And the Windscale debate proved a lot, but even more so at Sizewell and Hinkley Point. I called a witness at Sizewell, called Tony Benn. I thought he knows a bit, does Tony? And I asked if I could put a question to him. And the judge says, what's the question? I had to see him privately. I said, I want to know if I asked Mr. Benn to name the Prime Minister of Britain and the Foreign President who have reached a secret agreement to introduce the fast breeder reactor, the most deadly of all nuclear stations, into Britain. Nobody knows. Can I ask the question? He says, you can only do that if you go to see the legal advisor to the inquiry. I said, but you're the judge. He said, but you still got to see him. So I had to go right the way back to London. And I saw this leading counsel. He says, there's secrecy involved here. There's the 30-year rule, you know. And there is the Official Secrets Act. I says, I know, but what's it got to do with my question? He said, I'll tell you what, go back and see the judge and ask him. I said, I've just been here. He sent me here. I went back to the judge. He said, well, I will allow you to put the question, but if I feel the answer is going to reveal something, I'll stop it. And he did. And Ben said, could I help the inquiry? He says, I understand perfectly what Mr. Scargill is getting at. He says, and it is possible if you go to the Cabinet Office and or the Department of Energy, the information Mr. Scargill is seeking is obtainable there. And that ended that cross-examination. So the second hearing was at Hinkley Point. And Ben and I met secretly. I said, I'm going to put the same question, but I'm not going to tell anybody. He says, fair enough. So I stood up, and it was one of these inquiries drones on, you know. So I put the same question, and the judge must have dropped asleep. He never said a word. So I said, could you tell me the name of the Prime Minister in Britain and the name of a foreign president who reached a secret agreement to install the fast breeder reactor without the knowledge of Parliament or anyone else? No inject. He says, yes, Mr. Scargill. The Prime Minister was James Callaghan, and the President was the President of France, Giscard d'Estaing. I'll bet you didn't see one word in any newspaper, but that was a fact. And that alone should tell people what they're doing in secret. Look what happened with the government papers that were published in December, January this last year and the year before. One of them said, as a result of Scargill's activities on the Grunwick picket line, something has got to be done to get rid of him. I think they just meant move me on. And if you think that, you must be in serious shock. And the second one said, how can we defeat the miners, and what proposal can we do to outwit them, and can we use the armed forces? Well, I'll tell you this, I know that the armed forces were used. They brought armed forces in from Ireland and used them on the picket lines at Orgreave, where they knocked hell out of the miners. But I'll tell you something else. Those 10,000 miners on that picket line fought back like bloody heroes they were. They fought back for their rights. We've also got a policy for taxation. And our policy for taxation really lifts the eyebrows. We would scrap VAT. Value-added tax is a European tax by the European Union. It means that a multi-billionaire pays the same tax as an old-age pensioner. A person should be taxed on the amount of income they get. And if they did that, you wouldn't have a problem with our economy. How many people realise that 1% increase on income tax with the first £15,000 of income tax-free would raise $5 billion? 1% increase. Are we such a backward nation that we can't say, put up the taxation, the direct taxation, and fund our health service, education system, and social welfare? Help those who can't help themselves. In other words, look forward and don't look back. Now, I came here today not meaning in any way to be militant or putting forward arguments that were of a revolutionary nature. And if you think that's true, you've not been listening to what I've said. To quote a few chosen words from Shakespeare, but not necessarily in the right order, I come to bury the Labour Party, not to revive it or resuscitate it. Just like the Liberal Party in the 1900 period. There were trade unionists who supported the Liberals because they were our party. The leaders of the Miners' Union in 1910 were Liberal MPs. So those people who say we've always voted Labour aren't telling you the truth. The Labour Party wasn't founded until 1918. Keir Hardie was the General Secretary of the Independent Labour Party. But I'll tell you who my heroes are. My heroes are Larkin, who stood and fought in the Dublin lockout in 1913 and fought the fight. My heroes are James Connolly, whose foresight brought about a revolution in Ireland. My heroes include Keir Hardie, who have the knowledge and understanding to know that the policies being pursued to form a Labour Party would end in disaster because it would become a social democratic party and not a socialist party. And by the way, people who say he was a member, Keir Hardie died in 1915. The Labour Party wasn't founded until 1918. But I pay tribute to the role he played, particularly with, not for, alongside the suffragettes like Sylvia Pankhurst, who fought for women's rights at a time when they were being opposed by workers, even into the 70s and 80s. In my union, there were still people who argued, should we have women members? I stood on my feet at that conference and said, should we have women members? I said, their courage, their determination, their faith and their commitment ought to mean they're sitting on this platform as leaders of this bloody union, never mind members. If a vote had been taken of the women at the end of the miners' strike, it would still be going on. They didn't just serve in soup kitchens. They went onto the picket lines and fought back. They demonstrated that we are an equal body in the labour and trade union movement. Mr. President, I've been a socialist all my life. From the age of 15, when I first went to a political meeting, and I saw the vision of a socialist system of society where the means of production, distribution, and exchange came into the ownership of ordinary people. I still have that belief and that dream and that faith. And I hope that this union could be the first, as other unions were when they left the Liberal Party, to consider affiliation to the Socialist Labour Party. It's a decision for you, not for me. But I can tell you, I would appeal to every delegate to examine our policy. It's on sale with Kim and Barbara at the back. the best read you can get. It's not like the Gideon Bible. It puts forward a real policy for the future. I put it to you, comrades. When people say to us, your demands are too much, repeat the words of Connolly. Our demands most moderate are. We only want the earth. It's a privilege to have addressed you.